But now waking up to say, well, hey, I might die. Yes, you will. You will die. Either whether you die by an attack, you're going to die anyway. It's 100% guaranteed. The question is, are you going to live before you die? So I think the opportunity, what does it mean to live?
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And today we are delighted once again to have Stuart McAllister joining us because I have a lot of questions in life for Stuart and I grill him on a weekly basis. You guys don't always get to hear this, but this is going to be one of those. And part of the reason that Stuart is wonderful to talk to on some of these big theological and cultural questions is just his wealth of experience, but also really a deep reader. And it kind of annoys me, actually, that he's read every book that I've heard of. So I have a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about that. But one of those categories is in military history, military thinking, strategy, because, I mean, that's a massive part of the interaction between cultures and countries. And Stuart, I wanted to share a story. The more I look at history and military history, I feel like that our time is very different on a lot of perspectives. And years back, my family was visiting the Marine Museum, I guess, at Quantico.
Yeah, Quantico.
And that was before actually I knew our friend KJ was connected there. Shout out to KJ. But there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there, but there was one particular display, some video presentation at that time on the Battle of Billow Wood, which was a U.S. Marine Corps engagement during World War I. And what stood out to me is you had basically wave after wave of Marine charging across a wheat field into direct machine gun fire. Something like almost 10,000 casualties during that engagement around there. We can say, hey, Paris, you're welcome. But what struck me there, Stuart, is, and I've been thinking back through that, it keeps coming up. And I mean, that's just one battle of, we could look at countless examples of something like that. I think at that time, that was the highest Marine casualty in any given battle. But I remember looking at that and thinking, is there somewhere along like the 6,000th guy to run out there that there would have been something in the back of his mind who would have thought, maybe I'm not doing it. And so we can look back at that, but fast forward to 2025.
Sure.
And this is not an indictment of maybe it is. I don't, but I couldn't in my mind rack through a reel of 19-year-olds who would fly to a different country and charge into a machine gun nest across an open field just because.
Right.
Just because you're told to, pride, defense of your country, defense of another country at that. It feels to me like when I read that impulse in history, I don't see that in the world around me today. And it just feels like a different world. And so I wonder if you could help us kind of track the change there and what some of the implications are.
Well, first of all, thank you. And it's good to be back with you guys. And yes, I think you've got to look at it for two things. One is there would be people who would do that today, but those would be people like the ISIS brigades or people who are fanatically committed to ideology. And there are examples of that still mirror like the Bushido kind of things from the Japanese, the samurai during the Second World War. But I think the broader principle you're talking about is a shift in plausibility structure. And it is very interesting, particularly as you look through the First and the Second World Wars, particularly the First World War, where you had the rallying cry in 1914, and you saw all across Europe, in Britain, in France, in Russia, in Germany, in Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rallying to God, King, and country, or God, Kaiser, and country. It was some variation of that. But those were real internalized values in which people had these kind of internalized values and vision on what animated them about life. And so there were things, a shame and honor culture. People like to deconstruct all these things, but they weren't all bad. There were things to fight for, your family, your country, your unit, whether you're in the Navy or the military, the soldier, the infantry. You would fight for your regiment. And it was an honor thing. And also you obeyed orders because you believed that you were part of an integrated structure that had a moral and philosophical and psychological piece to it. I would say that to the modern era, we have been steadily, that has been either eviscerated or it's been transformed or it's been hollowed out. Not that we have no values, we just have different ones now. And the plausibility structure in our time moved very much from the corporate through even the mediational aspect of which I serve something, to the internalization of all authority and value. And so the rise of the modern self, which is ably argued by Truman and many others, actually, that we've been talking about, the phenomenology of our time, is that it's not that we're all bad, but we are all deeply individualistic now. And we weigh everything and how it makes me feel, not whether there's a transcendent value or a social cause or a national cause that I would be willing to give my life for. Not only willing, I would do it even though it goes against my instincts.
That makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people will recognize that as well, Dad. But I want to hear you talk a little bit about disillusionment in all of this as well. So you talked about, the First World War was the war to end all wars. Then you had another world war. And then, in America, many, good social commentators have pointed to the role of the Vietnam War in kind of knocking a final nail into the coffin of kind of patriotism. Love to hear you talk a little bit about that. That's obviously played a role too.
That's a very valid point, Cameron. It's disillusionment along the way. I think when you see the 20th century, the late 19th century going into the 20th century was very utopian. It was very idealistic. We had the breakthrough in technology, the Industrial Revolution. We had the breakthrough in thought. We had the rise of psychology. We had Darwin telling us that basically we came from naturalism plus time plus chance. You had Marxism as a philosophy. You had Nietzsche undoing so much. There was a lot of idealism that finally this was the age of man. This was humanism. This was the age. And of course, right into the launch of these great technological breakthroughs, diesel engines and incredible technological power was the First World War, which had the greatest casualty rate ever up until that point. But little did we know that round two, the Second World War, would be even worse. After both wars, there was a huge season of reflection. You had the rise of artistic movements like Dadaism in France, and just the theater of the absurd, the whole sense of existential. All these men who had died came back home, couldn't explain to their wives, their families, or their country the sheer mechanical slaughter, the brutality, and the poets captured it. But people were very disillusioned with idealism, with patriotism, with dying for nothing in rat-infested trenches where people were being gassed, slaughtered, crushed, every kind of brutality. Only then, of course, to see the rise of the totalitarians, Hitler and company, Mussolini, Franco, and on, Stalin, and the Chinese, Japanese situation too. And that war, of course, was catastrophic in numbers. But again, it never stopped. So I think as we began then philosophically and sociologically analyzing the wars, the rise of the wars, totalitarianism, having rejected God, increasingly we rejected man. And so we came to this kind of idea of the rise of a nihilism, not as a philosophy, but as you got particularly into our period from the sort of late 70s onwards, the rise of the postmodern, the deconstruction, where you were doing a deep dive in all the academic disciplines, whether it was philosophy, history, and you're pointing out all the people you thought were heroes. Some of them were tarnished heroes because they made bad decisions. Ugly things happened. We bombed Dresden. The RAF, slaughtered untold numbers. I mean, the bombing of Tokyo, we talk about the atomic bomb, 100,000 people were killed in the firebombing of Tokyo, which was bigger than the casualties from one of the bombs. But the point was, modern warfare was here, and the humanitarian aspect became a bit of an illusion. So I think that the utopianism has gone. Now we're into techno-utopianism and transhumanism and replacement ideologies. But it is fundamentally the same question. What is wrong at the heart of reality? Where is God in this? What does it mean? What is goodness, truth, and beauty? Are they even possible? Do we just basically, I'll just personalize this, shut the world out? So I think that disillusionment has gone very, very deep. And now because of film, song, history, and just awareness, we're feeling it very, very deeply.
I have a question on that when you mention film. But first, I want to back up and think through the transition because, your own father. So let's back up just one generation because your father was in the RAF, or how did that?
Yeah, Dad was in the RAF, and my grandfather was in the First World War in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders.
So, so what does that do for you though? because it seems to me you are a physical embodiment of the generation that's lived through this transition. So can you say something about, you're speaking to this not just from reading, I don't think, but I think you can remember being a 12-year-old and now older. I mean, is this played out mostly in your lifetime, or what were your teenage opinions on this?
I could see this, Nathan, because when I grew up, my mum was a young woman, but she worked in an ammunition factory but saw the bombing of Clydebank, which were the shipyards in Scotland, and could see the blaze 30 miles away, the fires burning.
This was your
Dad,
mom,
of course. Yeah, that was my mom, but my dad, of course, was in the Royal Air Force and flew basically in the Mediterranean in Lancaster bombers, and many of the people used to come around our house at the beginning were my dad's friends from the RAF. So I mean, I heard war stories, and as a little boy, of course, you loved that. There were a lot of the movies coming out at that time: 633 Squadron, the Dam Busters, and so the narrative was very fresh. And I watched the change. Then, of course, we went through the Korean War, and then the Vietnam War, which was more distant to us. But at that time, we were going through the IRA rebellions in Britain and the terrorists, the Troubles, as they called it in Britain. So it was very visceral. But I can remember that. I wanted to join the army. I was determined I wanted to be a Royal Marine. I wanted to fight for my country. I wanted to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. But then I was a part of the 60s generation, the kids who basically then get into the rock and roll and and destroyed my own life in a sense in those early days by walking away. So a part of that rebellion against all of that, I lived through and experienced. And it was in that era that I became a Christian and then began to sort of basically, recalibrate, if you like, or God recalibrate everything in my thought and my behavior. But yes, I saw those transition and the sort of the attacking of everything Britain did was evil, that the empire was horrible, that Britain had always been an imperialist country, that we were, and on through every layer of existence, right down to, the police force, schools, and everything else as being instruments of oppression and oppressing.
That's wild. Thank you, Stuart, for sharing that. That puts a lot of a lot to chew on there. I wonder, back to my comment, you reference film, and I think there's a certain percentage of, let's say, young men even, who would go and read something like one of these battles or something, and would still feel a little bit of a sense of like there's a moral, the vision that you outlined at the beginning of camaraderie and something to die for and friends and the common idea is obviously highly attractive, works for ISIS. But also like Middle Earth, or are there senses in which, look at the staying power of some of these stories in fantasy, that are still, so there's almost an individualistic sense that I agree with you has totally metastasized, but is not reflected in our most popular epic narratives and world building. Cameron's going to sort this out for us.
Well, I'm not going to sort anything out. I'm going to add a comment and then bring in a really unflattering story about me and ask Dad a question about it. But let's look at, just with regard to film, let's look at how war narratives have changed in recent years. So Guns of the Navarone or the Battle of Britain's, the Dam Busters, very, very different from war films today, which are decidedly more jaded. Not all of them, but many of them, especially, I think there was a spate of films that came out in the 1980s, Platoon, Hamburger Hill, that painted the Vietnam War in a very dark light.
And that kind of thing.
Right. So these were not patriotic films in any sense of that word. You think of, I think it was called Generation Kill was the HBO series. Again,
When was All Quiet on the Western Front written?
Oh, that was shortly after the First World War.
But that would be a beginning. I mean, it wasn't filmed, but kind of a little bit of the...
Yeah, but that was written. Of course, the idea was to show a bit the cost of war, and that the new film version of that was again it was an anti-war film, but from the point of view of the idealistic foot soldier who was just ground up meat in the end of the film. Basically.
I was trying to find a literary parallel to what Cameron was saying, but I think I swung and missed there.
No, well, there is a striking literary parallel actually, and the literary kind of cynical tone precedes film. It's faster. You have people like Ernest Hemingway and others who are taking a more jaded view of war and calling into question that patriotism. So that was happening. But so fast forward to Cameron in, or high school Cameron, 9/11 has just happened. And this wasn't long afterwards. My memory, is a little vague on precisely when it was, and I don't even know if you'll recall this exchange, Dad. It was one of many uncomfortable exchanges in those years. But you made some comment to the effect of, if I were a young man today, or if I were your age, I think I would enlist. There are some things worth dying for. And without even thinking, I was, there's no way I would ever do that. And it was the wrong thing for me to say at the time. But I was also speaking very honestly. And there's that chasm that existed between both of us. Your generation with a whole different, not just it's different values doesn't really get at it. You have a different vision, and me, highly individualistic. All of the items you listed earlier was very symptomatic of that. I still am. This is part of why I have to go to church and get my head on straight and have some of this stuff beaten out of me. But with that in mind, a lot of people will wonder, can we recover that? Patrick Deneen talked about how at Princeton University, when he used to teach there's a placard of names of the fallen students and now he says it's completely, after the Vietnam War, it's blank. There is no, and so he's saying, I would like to see us come to a place where that kind of patriotism exists again and is celebrated again. And I sit here and I find that it's hard for me to imagine us returning to that in any meaningful sense. I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I don't think there's been too much over too long that has eroded that. And we've had a new kind of constellation of personhood and of social interaction and values, and on so many levels that undermine that. It can happen, and it probably might happen through crisis or tragedy.
Yeah.
So you have examples, brief ones, obviously 9/11 being the big one, where you had, but here's on both sides of this equation is interesting. You had this immediate rise of shock, silence at first. Then you had people who would never use an American flag and wouldn't use one long after that, putting them out on balconies on their cars for a season. So there was a recovery. There was a little window. And then, of course, we got back to normal. The idea, let's all go shopping again. Let's go back to good old Western consumerist narcissism and everything. And we did. We went back to normalizing, and we keep the threats. Every time there's another attack, as in Louisiana recently, and as in Germany, and as in around the world, there's a kind of briefer but ever increasingly shorter point of reflection. There's scare tactics, blah, blah, blah. We add on the latest technological fear of drone swarms and whatever might else be next, and most likely will occur in some way. But I think until something big, that will arouse it. But we all I think there's something human where we want to burrow down and hope this will go away, and it won't. This is a question, I think, personally, individually, of spiritual renewal. This is a time of getting serious, not to be, but if the biblical narrative is true, and if there is a climax of the ages, then you don't need to have a map and plotting this is exactly where in the end times, from the point of view once Jesus was risen, we're in the last days. But there's obviously an acceleration on the technological, social, and other spheres. Things are going on. And people who have not taken God's spiritual warfare seriously, have not lived as a disciple, they've been a Christian consumer, they're now waking up to say, well, hey, I might die. Yes, you will. You will die. Whether you die by an attack, you're going to die anyway. It's 100% guaranteed. The question is, are you going to live before you die? So I think the opportunity, what does it mean to live? To live before God, to live coram Deo, to say, you are the king. Thy kingdom come is both a prayer and a commitment. And I get up this day and I want to follow my king. And I want to honor him through preaching, prayer, love, justice, service, writing computer programs, doing whatever it is. God, all things to the glory of God. But I resist evil and I fight. And if that means I lose a job or I lose a friendship or I get somebody mad, I don't want to get anybody mad. And I don't want any of those things to happen. But if that's the cost and consequence of faithfulness, that's what taking up the cross means.
I want to go back briefly to something that you said earlier that was striking to me. So you talked about, well, you do see this kind of devotion to a greater cause in ISIS and,
Yeah.
places like that, terrorists. Well, we seem to be seeing murmurings of it here in the US now as well. You have people who are doing good old fashioned agitating and not good and obviously not morally good, but this Luigi Mandione, I think was his last.
Yeah, it's the killer of the
the United Healthcare CEO. Well, clearly, what's striking about that. I mean, and obviously, he's captured the public imagination partly because he happens to be kind of handsome as well. But what's interesting is this was a politically motivated, carefully coordinated act from a guy from a very wealthy background who had what seemed to be everything going for him. So this seems to be an example of a person from a consumer culture, a byproduct of that in the system, Ivy League education, who doesn't want it and wanted to make a statement at great cost to himself. Are we going to start seeing more of that?
Yeah. So let's, yes, I would say I think we are, because if you go back to about 1917, around the world, particularly in places like Paris, it happened in New York, happened in Chicago, you had that anarchist movement, and it was genuinely, usually people of the same caliber, educated, middle class or upper middle class. In Paris and in Russia and Vienna, London, they were throwing bombs into cafes. So someone would come in, I mean, just a cafe of people eating their normal, they didn't know anybody, throw a bomb in, maybe kill 20 people, badly injure them. And some of them were killed in their own blast or were later captured and executed and so forth. And it was a movement because when the system breaks down and when there is no shared morality, you have either we have some kind of tyranny or oligarchy, which we are actually seeing already in the structural level of our cultures. But you have then the backlash is often anarchy and anarchism, where people say, well, stuff it. And that anarchism is to the point of, and then you have, of course, it's no surprise that you have many out there, tens of thousands probably, who will support it on the internet and buy into it. And that doesn't mean there's a mass movement. It just means there's many who feel like that. But we don't have a shared government. We have a breakdown in standards in which what that will do, of course, is will fuel deeper authoritarianism and with the technology, increasing control. So, the one fuels the other. Yeah.
So I think we cut you off. You're about ready to go. You're getting warmed up for a good sermon there, Stuart, which I appreciate. But I wonder if before we get to the conclusion of that sermon, I'm going to try to set the ball on the tee for you on this one. Okay, so I think if I was listening to this, and obviously you can read the headlines about military recruiters having a terrible time finding people who are physically capable versus anything else, but it seems to me like, okay, this is a Christian podcast. We aren't military recruiters here. We're interested in, you talked about serving the King, the kingdom of God.
Yeah,
we are recruiters for the church and for Christ's work. What are the parallels here that we see? Not in the perspective of the change in the military, but the perspective of the change of our willingness to die in missions and Christian mission. And it seems like, I can look back across a time where, it wasn't that long ago, you just packed all your belongings into a coffin and sailed across the sea and nobody ever heard from you again, to now, well, we need about $100,000 compensation per year and a benefits package. And we're going to, and it's nice that we have some cushiness to it, but and this is happening globally, that you say people like, I'm going to go die there for the sake of the gospel. But it does seem like there's a parallel shift that could happen, that the American church could embody the individualism that we're decrying in other categories into our own theology and the structure, where we no longer have a common vision of what the good is or a common willingness to sacrifice ourselves or something. Can you talk about that internal shift in the church as well, and what that means for missions, and maybe where we need to be recalibrating ourselves here back to an original vision?
There has been a very significant journey and shift on that. And you're right. We all talk about being in the world, not of the world, but for the world. So the church is in culture, and American church is in American Christianity and culture. And as the culture has got richer, more wealthy, professionalized, more educated, that has cascaded down into the church as well, of course, and good and bad. The problem is that we've often made professionalism, comfort, and convenience, and all of these systems, they kept getting layered on and layered on. So if you look at the recent Lausanne conference and you look at the worldwide mission, I've heard people saying they'd rather have missionaries come from Brazil or from Latin America because they come with very little, but they come with an absolute passion to learn the language, reach people, and they don't need all the accoutrements of the right kind of housing, the school for their kids, and all this kind of stuff. They still take those things serious and they do provide them, but they're not as dependent on them. Mm-hmm. So we have comfort and convenience and caring. That has become so much a part of our DNA that those are questions that are always asked. If not first, they're asked on equal authority. So when Jesus says, look, we need people to go up into these mountains and you may die from poisoning, or you may get killed by the tribes, or you may blah, blah, blah. And people say, all right, I'll pray about it and I'm going. Other people say, well, let's weigh the cost and effect. Let's do the assurance benefits. Let's consider the opt-in. No, I think the elders of the church meet. That's too much of a risk pattern. Now, I'm parodying that. I know that can be cruel and a bit unnecessary. But the fact is, I feel that the Western church, not totally, but we have adopted consumerism versus discipleship. And a consumer culture, I can't help it. I have been fabricated. I have been molded. I have been shaped. And the idea of the cultural liturgies, I have been liturgized. And not in a conscious way, but I love my comfort, my well-being, and all this stuff. The kind of life that Jesus calls us to is mirrored in a negative shape by some of these Islamic radicals and these kind of people who say, I'm just going, and this is the issue, and I'm going to do it. Jesus doesn't call us to come and exert power. He comes us to lay down our life on love, to love him supremely and to be driven by that love, to follow the consequences of that love, to be penetrated ever deeper by that love in my values, in my lifestyle, in my behavior, in my social outworking, in my justice, all of the above. So it is still happening, and it's happening in America. There are examples of this. There are very, very vibrant places here and there. There are pockets, but it's not mainstream. The mainstream is much more modernity-driven, highly organized, culturally relevant, cool Christianity, staying up with the latest, highly informed, intellectualized, managed, and molded in a particular. And unfortunately, we have to make a choice. What do we really want? Mm-hmm. And I think that going back to the Gospels, go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, read John 13-17 over and over again. You will have a very different feel to your discipleship demands if you stay in those texts.
So, thinking of a verse in there that's kind of, it is terrifying. And I think like in a modern individualistic, to pray thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Good night. That is that's all. So, what are you, give us some, it'll be broad, but like, what are practices that you're doing? What are things that you're praying to help you avoid, or what are things that are young people listening to this who have a sense of saying, yeah, Stuart's right on this. What are some of the practices in your life that help you kind of cultivate or, how do we lean back into this? We can't fix the world in the military, but we can work on the church and ourselves. So let's do that.
That's right. And so I'm a ruling elder in a church, and I'm committed to my local church. But my practices, whether I was there or not, which I will be as a part of but I get up in the morning. I go for a walk, and I use that as my prayer time, and then I read the scriptures. But I have been praying for many years, using the Lord's Prayer intentionally as a structure because He gave it to us, it helps me to calibrate. So the very first thing when I start off, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And I dwell there and I pray that for a few minutes. I pray, what does it mean? Hallowed be thy name. Here I am. I don't feel very good today. I'm a bit, tired from yesterday. There's something on my mind. Hallowed be thy name. I worship him and I take a few minutes. And then I move through, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done here on earth. And where I start, I pray for thy kingdom come in my home. I pray for the kingdom to come in my extended family. I pray for the kingdom in America, and I work through that. And then I pray for my friends in India, and I pray for my friends specifically by name. And I go through several countries and as God keeps bringing them to me, And then I move through the prayer, all that, thy will be done. If there's a political, social thing, I pray about Russia, and I'm praying about what's going on in Ukraine. I'm praying about the Middle East. I pray about social events as I heard them on the news, either as I got up or as I heard them last night. I pray for God's intervention, and I work through the prayer, thinking about people as God brings them to me. Give us this day our daily bread. I actually pray for thinking out loud. I pray for you guys. I pray that, Lord, bring us provision for the ministry, bring enough that we can live on and do the things we need to do. And as I go through that prayer consciously connects me to him and to my world practically. And then when I come back and I read the scriptures, I'm listening for reflective pieces that would give me insight into, if you like, my obligations, commands, instruction for this day or for this week. And that might lead to, a couple of emails or prayer or, appointments that I'm having with people. Now I listen for those, what I would say, spirit promptings. If God puts someone in my mind, as soon as I'm done, I send them an email and say, thinking about you, just praying for you, blah, 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 or whatever. And invariably, that's right. It was someone says, oh, just love to hear from you. Thank you. I was in a bit of a dark place, or just needed an encouragement, or, whatever. I think that's we've got to get this union and communion thing going, keeping it alive, but realize that cosmic conflict is the context of our life. We're in spiritual battle. It doesn't mean we wake up in the morning and my flesh is here and alive and well and annoying because it always wants things that the spirit doesn't want. So Galatians 5 tells me, got to fight this. The world around me is glittering with toys and distractions, and the enemy's on the prowl somewhere. He may not be bothering with me, but he's attacking somewhere. Some of his minions are out there, and they're only committed to evil destruction. So I see so many of my friends discouraged, depressed. I'm talking Christians here. And I want to pray for them. Brothers and sisters, look up. Let your God hold your heart. Reach out to another brother or sister. Help them. Let's join arm to arm and let's fight this evil. Let's resist it. Let's just pray, Lord, you came to destroy the power of the enemy. Have a great day of destruction. And let us be subversives for Jesus.
As you're sharing that, Stuart, I was reminded if you go all the way back to the beginning of our conversation and you said, we were looking at a time back then when people had something bigger than themselves to be part of. They had something to do. They knew what the expectations were. There was the camaraderie. There was the vision of good and evil. As you're talking about praying through the Lord's Prayer, you're ticking all of those boxes once again, in a different category. And so I just wanted to point that out as we went by, that really you're giving the antidote there in your spiritual life to one of the physical and psychological and cultural maladies that we were seeing elsewhere in culture. So just want to make sure that everybody listening notes that connection as we go by.
Yeah, Jesus said, that where our treasure is, there's our heart. In the Proverbs, without a vision, the people perish. This issue is so important that the kingdom is a reality. It's the government, it's the rule of God. The kingdom has come and the kingdom is coming. We are kingdom people. God's about governing. And government comes through love and justice and through spiritual power. We need to take the authority that has been given us in the scriptures, by the word, by God's mandate, and we need to exercise that. We need to stop playing at milquetoast Christianity. Stop being roll over and play dead when the enemy comes up, and stop burying ourselves in holes and hiding. I think the enemy will kill us one way or the other. So let's fight. We've got no armor for our back. There's nothing for us to, if we run, there's nothing to cover your back. All of your armor is forward and your weapons are outward facing. Well, that's where God calls us. Face him. Move ahead. Don't turn around and run. Resist the enemy and he will flee from you. That's his command, and we can stand.
Those are marvelous words, and I think very helpful to all of us and much needed. We're going to talk again soon, because there's something that happens every time we drop an episode with Stuart McAllister in it. Our numbers go up. We're trying not to be insulted by that, but clearly you listeners enjoy. It's the Scottish accent, isn't it? But thank you so much, Dad, for being a part of
wisdom, spiritual discernment, and
none of that. No.
Couldn't be any of that. So
not that. But thank you so much in all sincerity for your wisdom and spiritual discernment and for the wealth of experience you bring to these topics. We will chat again soon. And here's another nudge to you listeners. If you haven't done so already, you might want to sign up for TOL Connect. TOL Connect. You can do that by going to our website, www.toltogether.com. You can sort us out and you can continue these conversations. A lot of you have said that for a while. Hey, this got the wheels turning. There's so much more to be said. There is. Join TOL Connect and say it. But in the meantime, if you somehow missed it, you're listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.